Welcome to the latest episode of Chatting with Ingram. I'm Philip Ingram, and today I'm talking all matters intelligence and helping to put the world to rights with Justin Crump, the CEO of the Intelligence Company Sibylline. Warning, you will actually learn something. Justin, it's great to have you on Chatting with Ingram. Now, can you introduce yourself to our listeners and introduce what Sibylline is and how it fits in and what you provide out to the wider world?
Yeah, of course. And it's great to be chatting, and especially in this current slightly turbulent time. And while it's no shame not to catch up with you properly in person, it's been a really good period for focusing on what we do, which is fundamentally provide decision makers at all levels with timely, accurate, relevant and actionable global risk insight. And although we focus on the risk world there, it's obviously also opportunity that we like to encourage. Obviously, as security professionals, one can always get carried away with risky view of the world. But really, we're about helping people navigate complexity and find their way through to take good decisions. And of course, never really been more of a time for that, has there?
Definitely not. Well, and what gets me at the moment is we're stuck in the pandemic situation. The government has put out the fact that the pandemic was the number one threat through all of the government papers, and that's been out for at least 10 years. It's been down to local resilience forums, and yet we're finding local businesses, we're finding their care homes, the local schools, and everywhere else saying that they didn't understand what, and risk is a good word here, what the risk was, and therefore many of them hadn't put mitigation strategies in place. Do you think that people properly understand what risk is and how it should apply to business?
You know, you'd like to think people do, but I'm not sure they really did. And there have been a number of reasons why one could argue risk was overlooked, or rather too much risk was accepted. I think there's been a number of issues in how people have looked at the risk, particularly of pandemic, but that's probably true of some other creeping risks. So you come back to a key point. Was this unthinkable? No. Was this predictable? Yes, you just pointed out the fact that it was a top right-hand risk. Certainly, the local resilience forums in the UK, top right-hand risk in everywhere apart from East Anglia would have been pandemic flu. Government's top right-hand risk. But it's one of those things that has sat, I think, on risk registers for so long that no one really did anything about it. Now we've had 5 or 6 pandemic situations or potential pandemic situations in the last 20 years. The 6th one has absolutely got us. One of the other ones that reared itself up for corporations was in 2009. I probably remember corporations stockpiling Tamiflu and the fuss over that. And of course, it didn't necessarily come to anything in the end on the same scale as we're seeing now. That was really the last time I heard pandemic preparedness be talked about at length. Now, you also then came into that whole period of time when we were in austerity. It was about what we needed to do now. And of course, that meant that every organization or business was taking more risk anyway, either because of the market situation post 2008 put a lot of companies under pressure. There's pressure to perform in the stock market or for investors. If you were in government services, there was that pressure relentlessly to show value for money to the detriment potentially of actual service impact, right? So I think people were just taking more and more risk, and they were probably being ignorant of actually how much risk they were taking. And of course, pandemic was so large, the trigger was so hard to identify, the time frame was so hard to nail down that I think people just wouldn't deal with it because they were much more focused on cyber threats that could manifest tomorrow and they could do something about. And the idea of really saying either on a national level or a company level that you need to put aside money for resilience is something that I think just didn't really wash, because people said, well, why am I going to put aside 10% of my profits to deal with something that probably won't happen? Or if it does, hopefully long after I'm gone, that's my bonus. Let's get that back into the company. Let's use that in other ways. Let's generate more income off it. And I think many businesses just hadn't looked at that, and governments too.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The number 10 briefings that happened every day, and I think from a personal perspective, the press coverage of them has been appalling because many of the senior correspondents haven't asked the right sort of questions. And in one instance, Boris Johnson turned around and said that they had not listened to the risk assessments that had been provided to them, and none of the press picked up on it and held him to account for not having done that and asked why. If it's not happening at government level, then how can it be happening further down? But then I do know some very good businesses and some care homes and all the rest of it who had proper plans in place, and they executed those plans very early on whenever they saw the threat getting to a level where they thought they needed to do that. And surprise, surprise, those care homes didn't have any COVID cases. The schools that produced their plans had automatic plans to reopen. Some of them even managed to keep their classrooms going and had complete teaching packages for the children to deal with virtually. But there's an awful lot of others that hadn't even thought of it. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
Do you think that businesses are going to see a new appetite for looking at risk and resilience post-pandemic?
Yes, but I think there's always that issue with this, that the lessons learned too late. The horses have not only bolted it properly over the horizon, and off living a new life in pastures new somewhere else. And it's just
Yes.
about thinking about rebuilding the stables.
Is that the horses or one of your Jack Russells?
Well, yeah, having issues all of the above. But you have this issue with these. You have this issue with companies. I think most organisations, especially with this sort of thing, and we've both seen it in government and the military, where actually you've got a whole bunch of quite capable people, but there's a sort of collective group think about not wanting to deal with a difficult issue until after it's happened. And you can say, well, there's nothing we could have done about that, beforehand, really. We did the best we could. And actually, haven't we done well at muddling through? This is obviously a very sort of British trait to sort of say, oh, did we do well after we had a
Yes.
self-imposed crisis? Sort of we need a Dunkirk in order to have a VE day almost. So it's kind of an issue where we don't always like to learn lessons. And then once it's done, we just go and have a cup of tea, disband the military, and crack on with something else. And I fear that everyone will be so busy just trying to come over the immediate impact that when they get to the end, they'll say, thank goodness we got through that. And within a few years, again, the phenomenon of sort of thinking about this will start to drop away. So, I mean, we were trying to engage companies in exercises and things over the last few years. A lot of companies didn't even want to exercise or be tested because senior executives feared failure, right? So, of course, most of them weren't prepared necessarily to think about the implications of a situation at this scale that could shut down their business. I knew a couple that were. One of the CSOs of those ran a pandemic preparedness exercise at the end of last year, and he looks like an absolute rock star inside his company now. But again, he picked it because it was a top right-hand threat. He said, well, this one's going to happen. Terrorism outside the establishment may or may not happen, but who cares, really? That's a tactical issue. This is the biggest strategic impact. And I guess the one lesson you hope people will learn from this is when you think about scenario planning, especially in a complex environment, people like to sort of start with the world as it is and then work out to think what it might look like, and then maybe test themselves against bits of that. And often they only test themselves and they don't test dependencies with other companies or suppliers or their suppliers, right? Of course, in the real world, large scale situation, your supplier's supplier goes down, and then you lose your supplier. So your plan works, but because the guy you depended on didn't have one, or they hadn't tested theirs to the same extent, you ended up getting tripped up. What is really good, I think, for scenario analysis is start with what breaks the business. So if you're an airline, for example, this is an interesting example because US airlines spent a lot of money that could have been in resilience. Most of them spent it on share buybacks and things like that. So they're running very lean operations. And of course, what I suppose they should have looked at is said, okay, what would take down our business? Well, people not traveling. Okay, what could cause that? I guess major ash clouds are at one end of the spectrum on that. Okay, so how long would a situation like that last? That we lost all air travel, and how big would it have to be? I mean, you're probably at meteor hitting the Earth point, in which I guess business continuity isn't going to be the biggest problem. But okay, what else would do it? Well, pandemic. How will the world react to a pandemic? Top right-hand risk. Everyone's looking at this. Oh, right. Well, I guess there wouldn't be any air travel, or it would be very limited. Okay, so how would we cope with that? Well, the reality is probably wouldn't. All right. How many months do we think the world will be locked down for? 6 to 12. Okay, so we need 6 to 12 months cash flow at the minimum rate we can drop to, with minimal operations for a year. And if we don't have that, we're not resilient.
Yep.
Never went through that. So of course this happened. They said, well, we don't have any money.
Do you think?
You spent it.
Yeah. Do you think part of the problem is that the security professionals who tend to advise corporates on risk and all the rest of it tend to come at things from a gloom and doom perspective all of the time? It's this is the big bad bogeyman that's waiting to get you, therefore you have to do this to try and stop it. And then 9 times out of 10, the big bad bogeyman doesn't appear. We've had a number of coronavirus potential pandemics over the years with H1N1, with MERS, with SARS. And it's no accident that this coronavirus is called SARS-CoV-2 because it's so close to the other one, which didn't cause a pandemic. This one just happened to be that slightly different and an awful lot more infectious. So how do we convince businesses that working and looking at risks is something that is a business enhancing activity rather than just this big stick that's hanging over them like the sword of Damocles?
Well, yeah, and it is an issue with this. I mean, I'm sure I would get accused of being a doom and gloom merchant, but I remember the first person I saw who called himself Dr. Gloom to me was someone who gave me a lecture at Shrivenham about 15 years ago about the state of the planet in this sort of time frame. And I have to say, he was spot on with what he was saying. And I've been pushing some of the same. I'm sure you have as well. We look at these things. Even over the last 10 years, we've just seen, especially since 2016, we've just seen risk factors increasing. And we're fortunate. I've got a team of 85 analysts around the world. They're looking at this stuff. We make them quantify it. So we have a database that looks at world risk. So I can actually go back and examine trends and see kind of some of the macro changes or the micro changes that were hidden, but you can see them when you start accumulating the data together, which is great. So since 2016, we saw a steady uptick in world risks. And it was lots of small things going up. And actually, incidentally, terrorism fell down quite a lot because of the disintegration of the centers of mass of those organizations, which definitely hindered some of their abilities. But lots of things were ticking up: government instability, lack of political consensus, things like this. And you were seeing all these symptoms of it, increased nationalism and so on. But at the same time, the stock market was booming. And I remember I spoke to someone at the end of last year who sort of wrote to us and said, I just read your annual forecast. It's really depressing. You're implying that 2020 is going to be a very disrupted year with all these things going wrong. China and the US at each other's throats and all this other stuff. And, the UK changing course. And, I just don't really accept any of this. My company said it's best year ever. Anyway, he's now out of a job because not because of that, but just because his company was in the hospitality sector and they've had to cut everything they possibly can.
Yep.
And he, again, so it was risk tolerance. We were talking about a growing smaller percentage, but eventually those numbers will come up. And ultimately, being in business, and I guess I'm lucky because I wear both hats. I'm a security professional, but I run the business, so I live this. Running a business is all about tolerance of risk. But going into that with ignorance or willful avoidance of something is never sensible, and you have to have an escape route. Now, I've not answered your question as to how we best position that sort of advice. And actually, after something like this, it gets a lot easier. All you can do before that is kind of really show your working, show your evidence base. So that's why I'm quite big on the quantification now, because you can show the reasoning. You can really show it and say, look, I know you don't accept this necessarily, but I can tell you this is a growing risk. But of course, a risk really is something that affects the business directly. So I guess realistically, I'm talking about the threat environment. I can tell you the threat environment is changing. Of course, the business risk within that is going to vary depending on the business. And so a lot of it is in how, when you're in-house, you manage to enable the activity. So I think you need to have the ability to speak truth onto power inside the business, because that's the focus of all of us who are involved in understanding the operating environment. There's no point in sugarcoating it. There's no point in ignoring it, because it is what it is. It's an absolute, and we can more or less quantify that. We can more or less show the reasoning for that, but it's all about how you deal with it. So I think you can still be a business enabler in the way that you're doing your operations, but rather than being a total pessimist, doom and gloom, it's all too risky. Let's not do it because there's a risk. You have to accept the business's job is to accept risk, but you have to help the decision maker really understand it. And I think, again, scenario planning, options, these are things that business decision makers like to have, so they can make clear decisions. They can see whether they should go left or right, and they can see what the implications are if they choose right instead of left. And they can kind of think about both and say, well, I'll take this risk because I can see what the escape route is. And that's the most important thing. And again, I think in the pandemic scenario, everyone failed to tackle it because it was too big. Government failed to tackle it. It was too big. I mean, the EIU said the US and UK government should be the best prepared in the world to deal with the pandemic in November 2019. They happened to release their big global health security survey. US and UK streets ahead, two countries best equipped to deal with the pandemic. We sit here just a few months later, two of the countries that have undoubtedly done worse in the world for the assets at their disposal in dealing with the pandemic, US and UK, because of a failure of will to engage with the issue, I think, fundamentally, at all sorts of levels. And I don't blame politicians necessarily. They were looking at their own things. And of course, distracted by other things going on in the world that we've been focused on and talked about in the past, like Brexit, like Trump's nationalist stance and America first. When you balance all that together, you get this kind of, again, collective groupthink failure to actually confront a big issue. And because it's too big, and then it's on you and you haven't done anything about it, and you were afraid to tell the decision maker. And again, I go back to my friends who did do pandemic scenarios, forced their business to do them, learned the lessons. The business is now ahead of the curve, just having thought about it.
Yeah.
But so many haven't.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. If you don't know the risk, you can't prepare for the risk. If you don't, if you're not preparing for the risk, you can't accept the risk. So businesses need to understand them. So you have to know about it first of all. But when you're told about it, and it's interesting whenever you start to examine how different countries have prepared around the world. I remember the Prime Minister going on television saying, "I'm now going to have to tell you this is an instruction. Stay at home," because a week or 10 days beforehand he'd asked people to do it.
Polite request didn't work.
Yeah, exactly. It was a light request in the great British way of, oh please, just be good chaps.
Would you mind terribly?
And then would you mind terribly doing this? And then it didn't work. And he's going to get so much criticism for not having ordered people at the beginning. But I think that's I've talked to a British Chinese dentist who's in Shanghai at the moment. And I was talking to him about their acceptance of risk and all the rest of it. And he says, culturally, whenever the government tells us to do something, we do it. I said, but are you not concerned about the level of government control? And he says, we accept the government controls everything that we do and tells us all of these things and forcing us down different ways. But culturally, we just accept that. And if you look in Southeast Asia, similar things have happened. South Korea, people say that was the best test, track and trace. Well, less than 20% of people signed up for their track and trace app. So what the government did was it started to access everyone's bank account details, following what they were doing with their bank cards and their credit cards and all the rest of it, connected that to AI facial recognition software, connected that to their phone records, connected that to their national identity card, and then mapped where everyone was going and said, you were in touch with such and such at that time who had coronavirus. Can you please isolate yourself? And they went, yes, government, we'll do that. We can't do that in this country. Germany is held up, and yet in Germany, everyone has to register where they're living within 2 months of being there. They have to carry a national identity card. All of their mobile phones have to be registered with their address and a proof of identity to government circles. So they can do the same and have been doing the same quietly in the background as they're working through things. Yet we don't. And when we're asked politely, I think it's a great British thing that if the government asks you to do something, everyone in the public goes out and does completely the opposite. And oh boy, are we paying for it now? So what are the risks? You say the threat environment is changing and developing. Yeah. What are the risks that people should be concerned about today and going forward for the next few years?
There's a few really. So about 8 themes, I guess, that we like to talk about. And actually, we laid all this down before COVID. So we do like an annual forecast in November each year, which hopefully is in time for people to incorporate it in their business ones in December. So it's maybe a slightly counterintuitive month, but if we did it too late, everyone had already done their own, haven't they? So we weren't helping clients. So we put this down in November, and frankly, I'll give you the sort of points, but COVID's merely accelerated the issues that were already there. I think that's the way to view COVID. It's a ginormous catalyst. And not in many cases for the better, but it is pushing forward a few things like AI, automation, transformation of jobs and digital economy that was happening anyway, but it's just brought it forward about 10, 20 years, I reckon. But the big underlying things are still there. So what have we got? We've got, I think US, what I'll call disruptive and unpredictable United States since 2016. And I talked about how that risk level was changing before. Yeah. And that's no coincidence. That's been the time frame. And frankly, I think the White House would be only too happy to hear themselves described that way, because that's what they've set out to do. They've said America's being taken advantage of. We need to put American stuff first. We're not the world's policeman. We're entitled to look out for our own self-interest as what everyone else does. So we should be doing it as well. I think it is a shame, as a deep lover of the US, to have seen that change of course from a sort of very staunch and patient ally and mentor to so much of the world to being more of a, I won't say a bully, but just much more willing to be willful.
I'd say it's willful bullying, from the top. I'll quite happily say that, seeing what Trump's doing.
Well, yeah, and this is the thing. So, and of course, people are afraid to say that because they're worried about if you politicize analysis, of course. So I do try and I have my personal views on what I think they're doing, but actually even one can step back and look at the stance, and they're right. There's been significant foreign aggression, of course, and Russian behaviour has hardly been above reproach for the last 10 years, and China's behaviour, again, very far from a global norm, really. So, and they're just two of the most obvious perpetrators of some of the things that go on, of course. So, I characterise as disruptive and unpredictable US. Now, some of that won't necessarily change as well, given the election. I'll point out that I think that Trump's in for an uphill battle. He was last time as well. He got in, by a sort of 10-1 shot. So it goes to show that those risk odds can sometimes work out, right? But he is, he's facing at least the same challenge again. So I think there could well be a change, of course, in the US in some ways. But this track is now set, particularly towards China. That won't move. And of course, I think we forget that at the start of the year, you had the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and the entire affair around that. And that's how we started in January, along with an impeachment. Who remembers that now? But that's where we were at the start. So that was an example of short-term regional disruption for strategic, long-term advantage that the Trump governments were happy to put in place. So I think that's going to continue, and you'll see that really start to shake up international relations and break up global norms. And we've seen that around the World Health Organization since, and things like that. That is something that worries me, because if you look back to 1914, one of the big problems is all the great powers didn't want to go to war, but they had no way of telling each other that. And the UN, for all its faults, has enabled that sort of dialogue to take part. And that is why I think we've ceased to have those incredibly disruptive battles, especially in Europe. But these huge wars that we could have had, and I think to a large part that's been because of the international consensus and the hotline and things like that just allowed diplomacy to triumph. So I think watching diplomacy be taken to the edge is nerve-wracking for me, because it increases risk. It might only increase it from 1% to 3%, but I still don't like that when you're talking about large-scale conflict. And things in the Gulf could have gone very differently in January. I think we're lucky that the result was what it was, and it was a sort of no-score draw at the end, or 1-1 at best. So that could have been much, much, much worse, and I think would have been rumbling much longer if COVID hadn't come along and distracted things. But that's all still there. And of course, what's going on while we're not looking. So that's kind of the first one. That maps nicely onto what I'll call a strategically assertive China. So that is the fact, of course, that we've seen that China is just more willing to be active on the world stage, in some ways taking the stage that America is stepping back from. So actually China very much on the front foot about response to the pandemic, Chinese doctors visiting Italy and giving help at a time the US wasn't there. And even Russia stepping into that sort of vacuum in Italy at the time when it's all started. And of course, this is all tainted by the allegations between the US and China about Chinese having capitalized this in the first place. And of course, most recently, the progress in Hong Kong, and frankly, taking slight advantage of the situation caused by the virus just to clamp lid on dissent, what they hope is once and for all. But I think really setting a very negative trajectory in China's relations with some of the rest of the world. And it's just going to force people to take sides. So countries in Asia used to be able to look to America for their defense and China for their economy. And that's no longer, they're going to have to pick. And of course, that's extending to the UK, which is a very large U-turn on policy towards China. That was telegraphed, I think, in the cabinet, a month or so ago, but is now becoming more manifest that effectively we're putting our eggs in the US basket for trade deals, and China's got too many issues around it anyway. And the Prime Minister, I think, in particular, is against the Chinese trajectory now, and just proven by what's happening with Hong Kong. And I think we're now firmly in that anti-court at a very interesting time when you have Brexit coming up. So I don't think that'll change, and it is a new Cold War, and I think it will continue to go. And so I guess one of the third points around that is the fact that companies will, of course, increasingly be in the middle of it, and will be used as bargaining points in a lot of this, because of course companies are now very global. And to go back to the pandemic, actually, company preparedness was much more important to employees than the advice they were getting from government, because most of them didn't trust what they were hearing from governments, didn't believe governments could deal with the problem, but would turn to their employers for advice and trust that. Particularly manifest in the US, and you touched on it earlier about companies that had their stuff together and did well as a result, and kind of showed themselves to be ahead of maybe where the country was. And that was very notable. So companies are sort of finding themselves being strangely trans-global in a way, and sort of outside almost what they can rely on even from their host nations. But of course, it's making them pawns in these games still. So as HSBC is kind of finding, it's hard to be the world's local bank when every every country is slightly against the others, because it's one size fits nowhere, isn't it?
Yes.
So and Prudential moving to Hong Kong and basing itself in Hong Kong at this precise moment, it might as well have moved to Beijing and based itself there for the label it's now putting on its business. And of course, trying to navigate those complexities. I mean, who would have said 2 years ago that if you're invested in China, you won't be welcome in the US anymore? It was sort of lurking, but it's coming quite fast now. And of course, China is also not just a supply base, it's a demand center. So it's very hard for companies. You want to sell in China, you've got to be in China. It's not just a case of having cheap manufacturing overseas. And I think that's a very, that's just going to be more and more of corporations being in the middle of that. The other thing that's going to buffet people, policy flux and polarization across the G20, which is increasing, of course. And I think we've already seen a lot of that. Policy solutions to the crisis, of course, mean that nations are pulling in different directions. Again, that lack of unity at the top table is getting pretty evident, and it extends a long way down. Some other things I'll just highlight, obviously, rising authoritarianism. And again, that comes with the trend you were discussing about even the ability to cope with the pandemic almost requires authorized. It's against the whole way of Western living in a way, isn't it? You have to kind of enforce some discipline, and that is something that some nations are going to do better than others, and they'll actually come out of this better. And that's going to add that fuel to those more authoritarian regimes to say that actually they're doing the right thing. And this is a better way to proceed than embracing the US, UK, complete liberal democracy approach, which actually is looking awfully like chaos in comparison.
Yes.
Something that influenced the Russians, as I'm sure you know, influenced Putin after Hurricane Katrina, when he was astounded that the superpower that had beaten the USSR couldn't handle a hurricane in its back garden and didn't seem to know what it was doing. And that was one of the big things that set Russian strategy up as far as it has gone to date. And I think that's when the Russian government started to think that maybe the Americans weren't all that good after all, and just got lucky in the Cold War. So it's the reach of these sorts of incidents can be much longer than anyone thinks. So hence I think there's going to be quite a long tail of the influence of what we've seen recently. I guess, of course, authoritarian ties into civil unrest. We're seeing tons of that. That's then being linked, of course, into anti-corporate sentiment, particularly around the environment, around inequality, and both of those things are going to suffer as a result of everything that's going on. And again, the environment being the next creeping evil that everyone's trying to ignore until it's too late, and not preparing for. But there is a chance this will be a green inflection point. And those who are interested in this know this is the time to press real hard to get change of course on policy, because the door might be open. So I think there'll be pressure around that. But of course, then on the other side, there'll be pressure about the fact there aren't enough jobs. And when people are starving, are they going to care about the environment? Are they going to care about just getting a job at any cost? So we've yet to see where that goes. I think the final thing I'll just remind everyone is out there is terrorism and militancy. And in that regard, although terrorism is ticking down, obviously distraction from the security services and the police force at the moment dealing with lots of other things offers threat actors an opportunity. We all know that. There is a nexus between organised crime and terror in a lot of parts of the world. Again, the lack of focus and lack of willingness of governments to start spending money in remote parts of the world to combat terrorism will probably drop off a bit, because it's not the closest evil to the boat anymore. Now, lone attacks are going to remain most impactful, because they're the ones that will get through. Lone, unconnected, motivated people. We all know this because there's no complexity to unravel. There's no network of people you can get into and start understanding connections, and they're communicating. Going and buying very difficult bomb components and things like that. Someone buys a kitchen knife and stabs 3 people that afternoon. Pretty hard to intercept with the sheer numbers of people. But it's the right wing as well that's particularly worrying me. And if you look at all the trends throughout COVID, that's really going to accelerate. And that includes foreign manipulation of the right wing in Europe, UK, and the US. And we're seeing that in a pretty organized way from the Russian intelligence services. It's a great tool for them to use and embrace, and they have done for a long period of time, but they're accelerating some of those efforts. And of course, the environment. This was a disease arguably brought about by travel and foreigners into these areas. It can be linked very easily to migration. I think actually migration will continue at a much higher rate because of the economic circumstances we're likely to see. There is an unbeatable reality that actually Europe, the US, and the UK all need immigration. So there's push and pull factors that aren't going to go away, that are going to bring migrants to these countries, but you have an increasingly adverse trend in the countries that's sitting finely balanced. And I think there's going to be a lot of anger around those issues on both sides, but I think that's absolutely right for the right wing over the next few years. And of course, much harder to detect because they are the establishment in a way. if someone pulls up the national flag outside the house, that's not as obvious as putting up an Al Qaeda flag outside the house. So, at what point does patriotism tip right over into right wing, extreme far right movements? It's sometimes hard to detect. And of course, you've seen that in Northern Ireland over the years. At what point does nationalism go too far, and become another form of terrorism, pointing back at another community? So it's always hard. And of course, we've seen systematic attempts in the UK, US, Germany, and other places to penetrate the military, to penetrate the security services deliberately from right-wing actors, because obviously it's comparatively easy for them to do. And that really worries me. So that's a thing I think we're still taking our eye off a little bit. Although I know that at the top table, people are very concerned about it. And it's one for the future.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. You brought up a number of interesting points there. On the extreme growth of extreme right wing terrorism. Last year, well, about 18 months ago, there were 500 active investigations that Metropolitan Counterterrorism Police were involved in. Then they were given responsibility for extreme right wing terrorism. That was taken away from local police forces. That jumped to 800. Prevent referrals last year were about 50-50 Islamist extreme right wing. And there was a slightly greater percentage that went through into the full process. So it's growing. But you then link terrorism and serious and organised crime. Since the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, there has, if you take the number of terrorist-related incidents, i.e. arrests, weapons fines, shootings, bombings, beatings that have been put down to some of the terrorist groups, and divide it by the number of days that are there. There's been one incident every 4 to 5 days for the last 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement. And in 2014, Forbes International magazine listed the real IRA, which is a component of the new IRA that are the organisation that are accused of killing Lara McKee, the BBC journalist. They were listed as the 9th richest terrorist organisation on the globe, sandwiched between Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, and most of their income comes from serious and organised crime. In fact, all of their income comes from serious and organised crime. So that's fascinating. But then you talked about the policy flux and polarisation, and there's sort of two elements in there. If you look at who can concentrate on policy from a longer term perspective, and you've mentioned China and Russia. Xi Jinping's a leader for life. He can plan in multi-generational phases. Vladimir Putin has virtually been a president for life so far, or a Russian leader for life, and has just put himself in a position where he can't get, or he's not going to be out of power before 2036. So he can plan in multi-generational terms, whereas most of our governments are looking at what the headlines are going to be next week. And if we talk longer term planning, it's the length of a parliament or presidential period, and that's probably 3 years worth of 3 years out of 5's worth of real work. If you've got a forward-leaning, forward-thinking government with a majority that it can get things through, and there's not many of those around. And then we look at the big established international communities that there are out there, and just look at the debate that's been going on the last couple of days in the EU trying to approve the post-COVID budget. And they haven't been able to approve that. And that's supposed to be an organisation whose whole remit is collectively to work together. And then we bring the environment in. And isn't COVID-19 just Mother Earth turning around saying, come on, human beings, I can deal with you very quickly at any time with a very tiny little thing that you can't deal with. So grow up and look after me.
Yeah, and I think this is a hint, back to that environmental movement. Incidentally, you talked about us being doom and gloom merchants. I feel so much more optimistic after chatting with you.
I didn't say I wasn't one.
But I mean, this is the reality, because it is all building. I used to liken it to sort of empty glasses being stacked up on the bar. You're building a pyramid of empty glasses, and eventually, that pyramid's going to come tumbling over. It's just a matter of which glass sends it down. And I felt like all these factors are just slowly building up, and there wasn't much mitigating them. I said that the human progress is towards things like better power. We are improving in many areas. There are, arguably more democracies than there were. I think there's a wider acceptance of cultural standards, but there's a big pushback against that. I mean, obviously, there's always a counter-revolution, right? You can see Trump in that light, and his ilk, in regards to people who are pushing that nationalist agenda back in the face of increasing anger over other things. And again, the pendulum will always swing. We are making progress in the right way, but there are just all these small factors that we're not encouraging. And as you say, the fact that I would say, frankly, our adversaries can think much longer ahead than we can is a problem. And that includes actually Al Qaeda and Islamic State. So quite often, Al Qaeda in particular have been pushed into the background. They've been on the ropes. After Afghanistan, 2001 and 2002, they were on the ropes, and in the end, they likened it to the Prophet's flight, because they said, actually, we were nearly done, but then we managed to pull back and we regrouped and rebuilt. And actually, this is a sign that we're right. And of course, fast forward to now, and both those groups are saying, actually, the chaos in the US, the virus and everything else, again, is a further sign from God that actually these nations are morally bankrupt. How many more clues do they need? We've even got swarms of locusts, for goodness sake. So we've got everything going on at the moment.
Yes, exactly.
It's all happening, and how much more do you need, guys? And it's powerful rhetoric for a lot of people. As I said, on a lighter plane, again, authoritarian countries can say, actually, Western liberal democracy isn't all that in the end, is it? Look at the chaos in the EU, look at the chaos in the UK, look at the chaos in the US. Actually, you want to copy that? Or maybe we're just going to take a bit of a harder line and have some stability and order around here. And you can see why that would be more popular at this stage, than once it was. And of course, the economic advantage was the big thing. And actually, Western economies are probably going to suffer more from this virus than other countries, because actually, although the virus is rife, say in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, of course, the reality there is lots of other things are killing people that would be vulnerable to the virus. So we have a much worse impact because we have a vulnerable elderly population, because they're living longer and factors like that. Whereas, of course, if you're living with Ebola, then to be honest, COVID's not your biggest problem. So I think we're seeing some disparity in things like death rates, and actually the damage the virus is doing in some countries, even where it is prevalent. The bigger problem there is, of course, travel to those places in future for Westerners will start to get very difficult, because think of the fuss over Zika and sending travelers to places where Zika was rife. I think, imagine being the business now that sent travelers to somewhere where COVID was still doing the rounds. It would be unacceptable. So we reach the point that if a cure can't reach everyone, or if you can't mitigate the disease effectively for travelers, this is going to be a very long burning problem for international trade and how we go about trade and the way we used to do it, where we'd all hop on an airliner every 8 seconds and fly to 15 cities in a week and do business all over the place and almost make a sport of it. It's obviously going to be much more difficult.
Yes.
So lots of factors there.
Yeah, this is where business leaders, I think, are going to have to wake up and properly look at the risk and risk assess when they're sending people off for business trips. Because if they send someone off for a business trip and they're healthy when they leave and they come back with COVID-19, who is responsible for them catching that? Well, if the business hadn't sent them, then they wouldn't have got it. So is the business liable? And it's the same with this and with lots of other risks. So Sibylline is specializing in providing that sort of risk advice, risk mitigation measures, exercises, and various other bits and pieces to help companies deal with understanding the risk and mitigating it?
Yeah, that's, our function. I don't like to say intelligence too much. I think it's always a loaded term, and we're not trying to be all sneaky about it. But we are corporate intelligence advisors, so we are trying to help businesses understand that threat environment and provide the depth in a very complex world to see more connections between the data and more connections between the environment to actually be able to take those decisions. So across whatever the range of operating considerations are, but obviously focus more on what you call the security space and obviously into cyber as well, and blending that together. But it's just, again, know your operating environment, have a common operational picture, and then, of course, helping people be able to plan within that and make good decisions by maybe being prepared, for example, because it's obviously intelligence can only do so much ahead of the situation. Sometimes you can spot something happening, and other times you have to say, this thing could happen. It could happen tonight. It could happen in 3 years. But you want to think about how it will impact your business if and when it does. And it's really up to you how much sleep you want to lose over that. But these triggers are there, and they could go. Nagorno-Karabakh, for example, has been a frozen conflict forever, but it could boil over at the drop of a hat.
Yeah,
I can't tell you precisely when it's going to do it. I can probably tell you if the clock's a little bit nearer midnight or not. but at least by talking about it, we can think, how would that affect us?
Yep.
And again, that advice to businesses to start with what breaks your business. And I'll give a classic example, like losing. So a number of UK banks had all their back office stuff in India, but it was distributed around India so that no one power failure would take it down. No water failure would take it down. No strike in one particular area would take it down. Even some of them thought about nuclear conflicts, and even that wouldn't take it down because they distributed it north and south. Of course, what would take down their entire back office at once would be, for example, all of India shutting down its workforce. And again, there was one scenario that would lead to that. and they didn't really consider how that risk would work, and then also consider that those suppliers would then need to be able to work from home, which of course in India wasn't such a thing that people were really focused on, right? And they're more focused on getting people to come to the office and very much about presenteeism still in some of the call centers especially. And so they were still exposed. And again, it came to the point they were being pressured by the government to make loans, and they couldn't make the loans because they didn't have a loan office, because they'd all been sent home and had no work from home plan. Absolutely insane, huge loss of business and revenue, not been really publicly revealed yet for some of the banks. But they just couldn't function because they were scrambling to make something up because they'd never thought about it.
Yep.
And yet eminently predictable as something they could have seen happen and then should have thought about. And that's something that would have stopped them from working as a bank. So that to me was the critical risk they should have had a plan for. Everything else is irrelevant. Earthquake takes out your head office, doesn't matter. You can stand, HSBC in Turkey showed that you can stand back up in no time at all across the street. They lost their head office in Turkey to a bomb, to a truck bomb, took it down. And they managed to move across the street, put the logo on the side of the building, carried on working. You can survive that sort of thing. You can't survive critical impacts. And this wasn't a cyber virus.
Yes, and intelligence is all about trying to have complete 2020 foresight. And for those that are listening, and I'm an ex-intelligencer, if we had 2020 foresight, we'd all be winning the lottery every week. So that's impossible. But it's very, very easy to criticize intelligence with 2020 hindsight, because you know what the picture is and you're working back from there. The intelligencers never got that. Justin, I'll put all the contact details for Sibylline in the blurb underneath this podcast, but I think we've put most of the world to rights, and you and I should take over and chair the global organizations. It's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Chatting with Ingram.
And you, thanks for having us.